that really got me thinking a lot about how we operate in creationism. Right? I
Mm,
was searching for these terms that would help my students understand that I wanted to be a creationist and not an anti-evolutionist.
right.
And this started to get the juices kind of flowing.
Well, g'day. It is Ken Colson here with Creation Unfolding, back again with Dr. Marcus Ross. So, Marcus, great to see you again.
Hey,
Um,
thanks so much for having me back, Ken. This is
uh,
great.
this is great, yes, and sounds like a really interesting topic. Something a little bit different today that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about games. So, before we get into that, maybe just give us a quick intro about yourself, what you do, and then we'll get into it.
Well, I mean, I love games, so I mean, maybe we could, play a game of Pinochle or maybe some Monopoly or things like that. Now, anyway, for those of you on the channel who haven't seen me before, my name is Marcus Ross, and I'm a paleontologist by training. Got a PhD from the University of Rhode Island. I also got to teach for a long time. I was a professor at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I taught earth science, geology, paleontology, and was part of the Center for Creation Studies there. And I continue on as a fellow for the Center for Creation Studies, kind of an external position. And I run a science supply company called Cornerstone Educational Supply. So my wife and I started up the company coming up on 10 years ago now, Ken, actually, when we officially launched. That'll be in May of 25 will be 10 years,
Yeah.
and broadcasting live from the world headquarters of our warehouse in Lynchburg, Virginia. So for those who haven't seen me before, again, paleontology is my main interest, but Ken, you and I have talked in the past about things like historical atom issues. We've talked about fossils in the flood. We've talked about a variety of things, and today we're going to jump into kind of more not just thinking about creation topics, but actually thinking about what it means to be a creationist. And so
Mm.
that's kind of where we're going to be going with this whole games idea.
Yeah, that's exciting. So tell us what is this? I mean, we know what a finite game is. Finite. Well, actually, maybe give us a definition. Finite game and an infinite game.
So, yeah, for a long time, I struggled to try and figure out the right kind of language to describe what sort of creationist I wanted to be. I tell my students in my class that I wanted to be a creationist, not an anti-evolutionist, and that there was a difference there. But I had a lot of difficulty getting the right kind of terminology that would succinctly get it together until I came across Simon Sinek's outstanding book called The Infinite Game.
Mm.
Simon Sinek is an organizational consultant. He's a guy who goes into businesses and companies and tries to help sort out kind of bad relations and difficulties, and where's your organization struggling and how do you make that better again, especially on a personal relational issue. He's a really, really genius guy when it comes to thinking about interpersonal interactions. And his book, The Infinite Game, was itself influenced by a previous book written in the 1980s by a religion professor, James Carsey, called Finite and Infinite Games. So with
Mm.
that as a setup, what are these things? Well, Carsey said that any voluntary human activity that you decide to do, we can simply call a game. Just for sake of argument, anything that we choose to do, we can call a game. So our conversation today, right now, is a game in a sense. And Carsey said there are two basic types of games in the world. There are what are called finite games and infinite games. So the first one we'll take a look at are the finite games. These are the ones that are a little bit easier for us to immediately recognize. Now we think I'd mentioned Monopoly and Pinochle, right? There's those kinds of games. There's board games, card games, video games, etc. And those games have similarities to a lot of other human activities. If we think about those types of games, and we think about games like American football or the rest of the world's football, right? These kinds of games all have a definite beginning point and a definite end point, right? You end the game at the stop of the clock or once somebody hits a certain number of points, those sorts of things. There's also a fixed number of players in that game, right? There's two teams or six runners on the track or anything like that. And there are definite rules for how to play it, right? There's flags, there's fouls, you can't roll 3 dice in Monopoly, you only get to roll 2, those types of things. So there are very strict rules, fixed numbers of players, definite beginning point, times and n times, and at the end there's a way to adjudicate who has won, lost, or how well you did in the game, right? There's a way of measuring your progress and measuring your status against the other players. So when we think about those kinds of games, actually in human activities, there's all kinds of things like that. A easy example would be a political season, right? Where you've got a primary that determines who's going to be the nominee for the party, and then you have the official run for that particular thing between the two parties or the six parties, however many there are. So, once you've got your name on the ballot, you've got a certain amount of time. You can raise your money, but you can only spend it in certain ways. There's only so many people who can now run for that political office. And at the end, there's a number of votes, and whoever gets the most votes win, or you have some kind of runoff, right? There's all these rules about how to play the game, if you will, of running for office. But there's other mundane things that we do every day that are like that. You and I both spent a lot of time in colleges, and we took a lot of college classes. A college class is a game, right? The semester begins, the semester ends. You have a whole bunch of assignments in between. You don't have people jump in and out of the class like at random. I mean, you've got like your add drop period, right? Those sort of things, but those are within the rules. You just don't have like 6 more people show up in week 13
Right.
doing that. As a college professor yourself,
Thankfully.
that would be a disaster.
Yeah.
Right. So we can call that a game, right? There's all sorts of things that we do that have these beginning and end points. We can even think of like business contracts, building a house, all sorts of stuff like that. These voluntary human activities that run by these types of rules that have a definite endpoint and a way to judge everything is what we call a finite game. But there are other things that we do in life as well that don't qualify in that way. Things that Carsey called infinite games. And an infinite game, according to Carsey, is a game that has been going on before you started and will continue after you end, being in it. The rules are far more flexible. They're much more like conventions than specific rules that are more or less kind of agreed upon by the people playing it, but they can be challenged and they can be avoided or they can be amended kind of at any time. And more interestingly, unlike the college class, people can come in and out of these infinite games at any given time, and you might not even know how many people are playing. So give you an example, you and I both worked in business quite a bit. And business, if you want to think about it, is an infinite game. It was around before you and I joined into it. It's going to continue on afterwards. Individual companies are kind of like players in a business, right? In a setting, say, so for me, our company produces science educational materials. There are other companies out there, really big ones, really small ones, very general ones, very specialized ones, right? They're all carving out their space in here, but we're all competing in the game of business. And one big way that infinite games differ from finite games is the way that you kind of determine how well you've played. So in a finite game, you've got these measurements that you can have. How fast did you run the quarter mile? How many points did you have at the end of the game? Did you win the election? Right? All those things determine who wins a game. But infinite games, there is no winner because the game persists, right? The game just continues on pretty much forever. And the thing that's going to determine whether you persist in the game is whether or not you got the will, determination, and resources to stay in. And if you don't, you leave. You might not want to play anymore. Or maybe a competitor has driven you to a point where you're no longer competitive and you got to pull out, right? I've got to worry about that as a business guy that, other people might do the job better than me, or I might do the job better than them. So in a finite game, you've got definite competitors that you have to defeat. And in an infinite game, really what you have is what Simon Sinek calls rivals. Rivals that are in that game along with you that will challenge you to play your game better and might outmaneuver you in various ways, but they actually can't defeat you specifically. And that really got me thinking a lot about how we operate in creationism. Right? I was searching for these terms that would help my students understand that I wanted to be a creationist and not an anti-evolutionist.
Right.
And this started to get the juices kind of flowing. It started getting me thinking, well, wait a minute. If I'm thinking about creation from a finite game standpoint, then I'm thinking about evolution as an enemy that must be defeated according to a set ground of rules.
Right.
But is anybody going to agree with me on what those rules are?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How are you going to decide when you've defeated evolution? There's plenty of creationist and intelligent design folks that have written books and articles. I mean, I don't know, Ken, how many books or articles can you think of off the top of your head that talk about having dismantled or destroyed or defeated evolution?
Yes, lots. You can see it right on the cover, and of course, I think social media is a classic, right? With
Oh
all
my,
memes,
yeah.
you know. So
Yeah, this one thing, right, destroys
this
it
is
all.
it. This is it. Evolution's dead, or creationism is dead. Whatever. So yes, see them
That's
all the
exactly
time and
right. Yeah.
grossly dislike those books and
No,
memes.
so those aren't how you want to run your channel. You don't want some, big flashy, hey, Marcus Ross just destroyed,
Yes, you
deep
will never
time.
see that on one of my thumbnails. You'll see something that will pique your interest and get you in, but it will never be something decisive like that.
And that's because, as I describe this sort of thing, you're one of the people that I have in mind as I was thinking about, finite games and infinite games, right? There's some of us that are friends together that have been thinking that creationism has to be proactive. And we're not the only ones. I mean, there's lots of creationists out there that think that creationism must be proactive. If you look at, say, the International Conference on Creationism, right, in their bylaws is kind of the thrust of it is that this is a forward-facing model-building approach to creationism. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you grab one of those volumes that comes out every 4 or 5 years, and you and I were at the ICC in 2023, the papers that are presented there are not just anti-evolution papers. They are
Right.
papers that are trying to solve particular problems within young Earth creationism,
Yeah.
advance particular ideas, and they're not just reacting against, some new fossil that got put out as a transitional form. And no, it's not. Let me prove why.
Right.
That's a different sort of thing. And we run into those types of articles in plenty of venues, and sometimes there's some validity to that. So we'll talk maybe a little bit about where and when that's appropriate, because it is. But that really got me thinking. And Sinek's book in particular, again, his book was called The Infinite Game. And he took Carsey's ideas about finite and infinite games. And Carsey's ideas were really about trying to live a good life. He was a secular humanist who wanted a moral ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, really, what you should do is orient yourself towards these infinite games. Don't play finite games, play infinite games, become a better person. So, for example, I would talk about classes like Theology 101 is a finite game, but becoming Christ-like, that is an infinite game,
Right.
right?
So
I
theology
enter into
101
this,
as in the class, right? Your
right?
16-week class has a beginning and has an end. Yeah.
That's right. And it's got tests, it's got quizzes, it's got discussion boards if it's an online class, right? Those sorts of things. But becoming Christ-like is not a finite game. There's no end to it.
Yeah.
There can't
Right.
be.
Mm-hmm.
But people becoming Christ-like was happening before you and I became Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And it will continue to happen as long as the Lord tarries.
Yeah.
And our goal in becoming more Christ-like is this thing that's sort of out of reach,
Yeah.
but it is a target that is
Mm.
out there that we can fix our eyes on
Yeah.
and that we can go towards. So when I started thinking about that, what Sinek did is he said, a lot of folks in business play business as if it's a finite game, right? You take a look at most commercials, any truck commercial out there that's going to like talk about how great the truck is, they're going to tell you it's best in class with towing, or it has the best payload, or it has the best acceleration or the most powerful motor. Nobody else has got this.
Right.
Well, how did they come up with that metric? Oh, they decided which metric they were going to choose because they knew they were already the top of the heap on that one metric.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you want to tow something, best tower on the market is going to be a GMC truck, right? Or, an electric vehicle, because those things have more torque than, you could tear a house off its foundation.
Yes, they can.
But on the other hand, if you want to talk about fuel economy, it's a different truck, right? So one of the things Sinek talks about in business is that these finite game approaches of trying to like defeat the other players out there
Mm,
always involve picking metrics that are self-serving
mm,
and deciding that we're the best, we're the number one, we're the best company out there because we have the most products. Well, that may be true, but are your products any good? Or we're the biggest company because we have the most warehouse space around the country,
right.
or we serve the most metropolitan areas, or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
those might be kind of helpful to distinguish yourself a little bit, but you've got to not use those to think that you're going to defeat your enemies, because your enemies actually don't care or shouldn't care
Hmm.
about that. And Sinek actually goes into some really great examples of when companies started really caring about each other's finite game mentalities, and it destroys everybody.
Hmm.
It destroys everybody because you just end up in a war between two companies that will just spend and spend and spend to try and be better than each other.
Right.
And oftentimes it ends up in disaster.
Right.
You know,
Rather than
it's
just promoting their product.
right. And thinking constantly that these other companies that are out there doing similar types of things should be motivators for us to do a better job, not to try and match or outdo the things that they do.
Hmm.
Right? So if you've got, McDonald's and Burger King out there as two companies, McDonald's and Burger King are doing really similar stuff, right? I mean, it's burgers and fries and chicken and breakfast foods and stuff like that. But if they're constantly looking at each other's prices and each other's menus and trying to one up each other, they're actually going to probably lose sight of the core things that they do really, really well.
Right.
And I'll just say, for Burger King, I'm not sure what that is, but that's
What's
that's
funny is
my
that
sorry.
here in Australia, Burger King is called Hungry Jack's.
Hungry Jacks.
Yeah, and in America, Burger King is like it's kind of the lower, right on the lower end of the spectrum. But because we don't have a lot of sort of burger places here in Australia, although it's still down there, Hungry Jack's is actually not a bad burger place. And I I love the Whopper, but I don't love the Whopper in America. I've been to Hungry
Ah,
Jack's in America. I went once, and I'm like, I'm never coming back. But it's a different story here. So just for you need to know
interesting.
that.
Very, very interesting. The peculiarities of us being on opposite sides of the world
Yes,
here.
yes,
Yeah, and Hungry Jack's apparently getting the job done right over in
yes,
Australia,
yes.
and focusing on what you do right. Does you kind of know that places like Walmart and Amazon constantly are checking each other out and kind of positioning to try and be better in some way than each other, but they're also working very hard not to try and blow all their capital trying to do stuff that they know the other team is doing incredibly well.
Right.
When that happens, you end up making a lot of mistakes. And so that, I think, of all the things, as I was reading Sinek's book, because again, I've got a business now and I got to kind of think about business and doing it well, because
Yeah.
we don't get trained for this sort of stuff.
Right.
Taking that idea and bringing it over to young earth creationism and saying, okay, if my focus is constantly on evolution, if my focus is constantly on what they're doing, and how to tear it down, number one, I'm never going to be out of a job, right? Because they actually aren't paying any attention to us for the most part, right? There are
Yeah.
very few folks in the evolutionary or old age geology community, or astronomy community, that are paying close attention to what happens in young earth creationism. I think that's unfortunate, but it's the situation.
Yeah.
And if we're doing a whole bunch of stuff saying, hey, we're disproving everything that you guys have done, they might not recognize that that's happening, or they might not even agree with the methods through which these were being done, right?
Yeah.
So instead, what we have to do is actually do the harder job. And the harder job is to focus on the task of building a comprehensive model of creation. And we don't have one yet, right? We've got a variety of things that are all vying. We've got some basics, we've got biblical constraints on what we do, and we've got a lot of agreement within the creation community about certain aspects, but we don't have a singular unified model like the evolutionary community more or less does, right? Or at least the old age geology community more or less
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
So that's the tougher thing. It's easy to kind of pick at somebody else and show that they've made mistakes, because we all do.
Hmm.
That's uncontroversial. And instead, if we put forth an idea, that actually opens us up for the same kind of critique, right? Somebody from the evolutionary community can look at what you and I have proposed and said, oh no, you know what? It's not going to work for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Right.
We've got some other folks on the internet that pay very close attention to young Earth creationism and are very happy to point out, where we've gone wrong or where different
Right.
creationists have gone wrong on stuff.
Yes.
So, I want to be of the approach and the opinion that creationism in a finite game approach can't at least be the main way we do things.
Mm.
Instead, the main way that we do things has got to be the infinite games.
Mm.
It's got to be focused on how to build out a model of creation, how to go about proposing hypotheses, gathering data, testing those data, and seeing what happens, right?
Right.
Getting feedback from the world that God has made,
Yeah.
and then tweaking what we know, right? If the hypothesis doesn't work out, try another one. See if this works out. Grab more data. If you think you're on the right track but you didn't get good results, try gathering more data. Is that going to be helpful or not? Right? Are you
Mhm.
barking up the wrong tree?
Right.
It's that's normal science. That's
Yeah.
the normal way of
I mean,
doing
would you
things.
say what do we think of science? Is science itself is sort of an infinite game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It started long before you and I were around. It started long before any major scientist we could point to alive today started. It started before Newton. We might try and peg a time in which science began,
Right.
but that's always going to be kind of hazy, right? As we transition into the period of science, enlightenment, et cetera.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I wrote about this for the first time in an article in Sapientia, which is a online journal of the Henry Center at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. So this was part of a series: intelligent design, young Earth creation, old Earth creation, and theistic evolution. All got a chance to have like 5 representatives
Mm.
lay out a case
Yeah.
with an editor. And our editor was Hans Matawami.
Mm.
I think you've had him on the channel.
Yep. Yep.
And
Great guy.
yeah, Hans is fantastic. And he asked us a brutally difficult question. There were no kid gloves with Hans's question. And his question, if I can pull it up here for a moment, make sure that I say it right. Or I don't have the exact phrasing of it right in front of me, but more or less the question came up of, all right, young Earth creationists, it kind of seems like science has shown you guys aren't viable, so why should we listen to you? Yeah,
Hmm.
it wasn't that rough, but it was pretty tough.
Hmm.
How is it that young Earth creationism is actually still relevant,
Right.
given the situation in science, which seems to point to an ancient age of the Earth, to biological evolution,
Yep.
etc. Not everybody got this question. This wasn't the question posed to intelligent design or theistic evolution.
Right.
Looking back and reading those groups, their editors gave them a little more, straightforward. You could even say kind of cupcake questions. Lay out your case.
Yeah.
Hans was like, listen, people want to know whether or not we should be listening to you guys at all anymore. So I'm going to ask the question that's on their mind.
Yeah.
And it was
That is an
difficult.
exceptionally great question.
You think
That,
so?
oh
So
yeah. I mean, it's
why do you like it?
I like it because if you're a Christian, I mean, this is only really important to Christians, right? I mean, as a Christian, why should I believe in young age creationism? Now, I guess one of the answers might be, well, because the Bible teaches that. But that's a very broad sort of answer. I mean, for me, I mean, straight away, I knew exactly what the answer was. When you said that to me, I'm like, why is this important? And for me, it's because of the problem of natural evil.
Mm,
That's the big problem for me. And that trying to live with what we see in the natural world without a moral cause, being Adam and Eve, and their sin, is problematic for the Christian faith. And so that's why people need to embrace young age creationism. That's my perspective.
mm. I picked up the question as it was. This was it. Is it really tenable to be a young Earth creationist in the face of the overwhelming scientific evidence that counts against it?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That that's tough.
Yes.
as far as that's your lead in, right? And I know other young Earth creationists were like, "Hey, that's just not fair." But I think it was fair.
Yeah.
There's
That's a great
you know,
question.
you and I would go to like Geological Society of America meetings or things like that, right? There's thousands of geologists out there, and there's 20 or 30 of us young Earth creationists there.
Hmm.
Those are pretty overwhelming odds, right? That's 100 to 1
Yeah.
out there, and that's just the people who show up, right?
Right.
And that type of thing. So that was a hard question. So I decided to answer that question by introducing this concept of finite and infinite games, and saying where I think young Earth creationism needs to direct its attention, and then from there, hopefully give a few examples, right, of the types of people and the types of projects that within young Earth creationism fall along that idea
Yeah.
of infinite game thinking. So I guess some of the people that I mentioned in that would not be surprising to you certainly, and to probably a good number of your viewers and listeners here, would be folks like Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick, folks particularly well from your PhD studies,
Hmm.
and their work and their research looking at any of a variety of things. I mean, Art Chadwick and Leonard Brand have always had a good mindset towards solving issues and thinking like a creationist and approaching the geological record.
Yeah.
Whether that's looking at footprints in the Coconino sandstone, which is early work done by Leonard Brand, and grabbing little salamanders and modeling their walking behavior in tanks that
Yeah.
had dry sand and wet sand and underwater, in order to see, do the footprints in the sandstones out there in the desert Southwest, what do they match up with? Do they look like little critters that were pawing around on dunes, that were dry sand dunes, or do they look like something that was moist? Or turned out it looked exactly like the types of handprints and footprints that are made when the salamanders were walking in fully submerged water,
Hmm.
which was honestly, I think, completely unexpected.
Yeah. It's a great
Given that
paper.
everybody in the geological community thought that these were above air Sahara style sand dunes.
Hmm.
And these little footprints are like, no, not there's no good analog in a dry sand dune to make these types of prints.
Hmm.
Or Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick, decades later, looking at the geological record and measuring how much bioturbation there is in the rocks. And for the readers and for the listeners here, bioturbation means when animals stir up the soil. So you have bio of life and turbid, stirred up. So as animals are looking for food at the bottom of the ocean, they're tunneling through mud, or they're making little burrows for themselves, they stir up the sediment. And it turns out they stir up the sediment at very rapid rates.
Mm.
If the water column is oxygenated at all, and if there's any nutrients to be found, it takes no time at all for animals to completely obliterate any type of nice layering in
Just a
the
few
sediment.
years. Just a few years.
Sometimes
Tops.
even
Yeah.
sometimes even hours can.
Yeah,
Sometimes
that's
even
true.
hours. So there were
Yeah.
some really neat experimental studies that were done where researchers took like a meter by meter grid of sediment, and they laid out all these nice layers in it, and then they dropped in like, you know, 10, 15 worms and clams and shrimp to represent a very sparse population
Mm.
inside that. And they found that they bioturbated that within a day or
Mm.
so. And if
Yeah.
they loaded it with, an appropriate amount of organisms that you might find, say, in Chesapeake Bay, not far from where I live, if you look at that, where there's a much more dense community of organisms, you might have 100 organisms in that same meter grid.
Hmm.
The bioturbation rates were as fast as 64 minutes.
Mm.
There's no layering to be found at
That's
all.
fascinating.
And
Yeah.
it really is just a great study to see how fast this happens. And that relates then to creation, evolution, age of the earth issues, because if organisms can bioturbate that quickly, then as you look at the rock column and you see that there's all these really nice layers with great fine delineations to them,
Hmm.
why would that be the case?
Hmm.
There are some places in the world today where the conditions would allow those to persist, right? There's no oxygen or something like that.
Right.
But those environments are not the norm, and they're certainly not the norm for the types of deposits we have on the continents that
Hmm.
we're able to access. And so it would seem to me that if the Earth was tremendously ancient, we would have the vast majority of the sediments without any sort of layering whatsoever.
Yeah.
And instead, Brandon Chadwick found out that really bioturbation is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Very, very rare. So
Yeah.
just a great example of this infinite game thinking. It took them years because they actually measured a vertical miles worth of sediment,
Mm.
starting in the Grand Canyon and making their way all the way up to the Green River Formation
Hmm.
in Wyoming. So, they didn't traverse all the miles there, but they traversed all these different sections of well-exposed rock to look at bioturbation.
Hmm.
And so, what a great example of a long-term research project that had definite aims and goals and produced interesting results. I mean,
Right.
hey, there's science,
Yeah.
and so it's not surprising that, they, publish this sort of stuff or go to
Right.
GSA and present
Right.
papers and
And I think
stuff.
importantly too, as part of the infinite game, what we're saying is, and this research is excellent, and hopefully we'll actually see that paper come out soon.
Yeah.
But this paper, has not destroyed the concept of deep time, right? It's part of the dialogue we're having in science, and right now, that piece of evidence sort of weighs more closely over to a young age creationist perspective. That's not to say things couldn't change in the future. That's what science does. But we're playing the game, right? And so,
Right.
what we don't want to do is take these excellent research projects and decide that well, that's it, we the game is finished, and then publicize that to everybody out there that, hey, this is it, this is a no-brainer, evolution's dead, let's sort of move on.
That sounds like the next thumbnail for, the video that you bring them on for. That's it. Evolution's dead. We're done.
I tell you, my subscribers would go through the roof. Unfortunately, like, that's what people are looking for, right? They're looking for these silver bullets that put an end to evolutionary theory or deep time ideas. And silver bullets, I mean, I think they're a pipe dream. Ultimately, we need to be working on modeling things like what you're saying.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about the silver bullet issue because, thinking about the history of science and some of the big shifts. I mean, take the biggest shift of them all, right? The Copernican revolution, the Galilean revolution. Was it a silver bullet that ultimately switched people's mind from geocentrism to heliocentrism? It wasn't, right? Copernicus put together a model. A lot of people didn't like it particularly. It was mathematically about equivalent. It seemed a little bit more elegant than Ptolemy, but it wasn't as predictively useful. And Galileo definitely improved that to the point where it's kind of almost a toss-up. And without getting into all the issues and the troubles that Galileo had, with his proposal, but it still didn't tip all the scales, right? Kepler came around and he helped to explain why some of Galileo's assumptions were incorrect, because everybody was thinking that all the planets, orbited in these perfect circles, because they're still Aristotelian and Platonic thinkers, that you've got to have ideal forms because the heavens would have to be ideal, because ideal is godly. And it turns out, well, ellipses do a great job of maintaining orbits, right? They do really great job. So Kepler discovered that, but it wouldn't be until Newton that there was a solution to why we don't all fly off of the Earth as the Earth is rotating and spinning. Galileo was challenged with that idea. How come we're not tossed off of the carousel? And basically, he didn't have any answer. He's like, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm right. which,
Right.
which, in the end, yes, but not very satisfying on that. So it wouldn't be until Newton comes around, 100 and some years later, to be able to say, no, gravity is going to be able to explain this. A really mysterious thing, right? These attractive forces between two things that aren't connected to one another. I don't know. That's kind of occult and weird, right? A lot of people were a little put off by it, but it turned out he was right.
Yeah.
That there is this attraction based on mass of objects. That finally did things, but that, people had bought into Galileo long before then and were living with the tension. And I
Right.
think that's a really important thing for us as young earth creationists to know, both for ourselves and also for the evolutionary community, is that we all have approaches and explanations for the world that are incomplete. And therefore, we all end up living in these kind of tensions
Hmm.
with the data.
Right. Yeah. And I think like having the doing science in the present versus doing science in the historical past is different, right? So we
Hmm.
can, I think showing that the Earth is a globe or demonstrating heliocentrism depends on what we're experiencing in the present and is verifiable through experimental evidence. And so we can come to a definitive conclusion about that. Whilst looking at things that happen in the past, we can't do that. We've got to use circumstantial evidence, right, in order to try and figure out what happened in the past. And then we've got to use interpretation to try and put those bits together. So I'm just thinking, based on what you've said about the scriptures and what we know about science from those two perspectives, how does that play into the infinite game? Like when it comes to cosmological perspective, like local to us, say the sun and the moon, is that an infinite game anymore? Like that little piece of
Mm.
science, whilst obviously historical things, they have to continue to be a part of this infinite game. I guess that's what I'm thinking. Like,
Yeah,
do we
yeah,
draw a
I
distinction
think I
there?
follow. I think I follow what you're doing, and I think this gets us into the interesting question of how finite games fit into the picture here. So science is an infinite game. Knowing God is an infinite game. Politics, sadly, is an infinite game, right? It's going to continue to
Right.
go on no matter what, right? So these kind of like categories and topical concepts are infinite games. The question of heliocentrism or geocentrism is, in fact, a finite game question
Mm. Yeah.
because you've got two options here. Now, you might have a third that you don't know about or whatever, but let's just say we've got two options. And if we can agree upon the means by which we're going to adjudicate that question, right? Science rules, for
Right.
example,
Right.
then it can be a finite game
Right.
because this question can be answered, or at
Yep.
least that's the goal, right?
Yep. Yep.
If if we could never actually get to an answer to that particular question, if it was just a quest for knowledge about the sun. So let's change the question a little bit. What can we know about the sun? That actually can be an infinite game because there's conceivably
Yep.
always more to know.
We can't get into the sun, and we never
That
will get into the
right.
sun.
That's absolutely correct. Right. And so we still put satellites out and probes and orbiters and things like that that are pointed directly at the sun to try and get more information so we understand how it works better. That we can predict things about how it's going to behave when it's going to have a coronal mass ejection or, all those sorts of things. Solar research is an infinite game
Yeah.
until people no longer are interested or have the ability to study it.
Yeah.
But the question of, is the sun or the earth the center of a system? That is a question that can be answered and so becomes a finite game.
Right. Yeah.
But it's also a finite game because the two sides can hopefully agree on at least the methods and the practices and what counts as good science and all that sort of stuff. And
Right.
and that happened enough over the history of science that we've come to a conclusion,
Right.
a
That's the word I
resolution
was
of it.
thinking of. Conclusion. I was thinking that's the
Yeah.
word, right? We
Right.
come to a conclusion, and therefore, like a class, the game ends.
Yeah. So I think maybe one of the big differences then, just spitballing this with you and thinking about it, one of the big differences between that and say the age of the earth is that you and I, as young earth creationists, have a slightly different set of constituent parts to how we do science
Mm.
than our colleagues on the secular side of things, right? Or Christians who think that we should use methodological naturalism as our guiding principle of science, that science can only use natural explanations in order to come to its conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
If that were the case, maybe the answer would be already answered, but maybe not. Let's just say it could be open. But you and I think that the Bible actually is part of the evidence that counts towards our answers on these
Exactly.
things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If we have interpreted and understood the Bible properly, if it has given us accurate clues about the way the world is and was,
Mm-hmm.
then you and I are committed to that so much that we say that needs to be part of how we understand the world.
Yeah.
Right? That's got to be part of the evidence base.
Yeah.
Whereas, some of our brothers and sisters in Christ don't look at it that way. They're like, no, the Bible is telling us about theology, and it stays in that box.
Yeah.
And science tells us about the natural world, and so this is a different box, and these two boxes can't meet.
Right.
And because of that, I think is one of the reasons why we're going to struggle to come to a resolution entirely between the secular and the sacred on
Yeah.
this. But you and I are also scientific realists, right? We do think that science is getting us towards real conclusions,
Right.
at least good proxies for real conclusions, right? And that science can and will hopefully do better over time at explaining things and discovering stuff, so that you and I hope that eventually these right now kind of separated worlds eventually merge and overlap. We have the faith and confidence that that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And those who think that it's impossible, we're always going to struggle with.
Yeah.
We're always going to run into kind of problems. From my own experience in graduate school, that was the big crux of what got me into so much hot water when I was working on my master's degree at the South Dakota School of Mines and Tech. They accepted me into the program knowing that I was a young earth creationist because, my undergraduate advisor let them know. And they said, yeah, we know that, but, here we do things by the scientific method. And, in my brain, I'm going, okay, I get what you're saying. You're methodologically naturalistic. I do things by the scientific method as well. But I don't think we're exactly agreeing on what those methods entail. And it was fine for me to be there as a young earth creationist as long as that didn't actually mean anything. But as soon as I made my voice on these issues known outside of the class, right? I wasn't trying to flunk out of my classes by raising creationist arguments or anything like that. But when I spoke up at InterVarsity on the campus, and I wrote something for the school, let's call it a newspaper. It was a rag, 8.5 by 11 paper, folded in half. I mean, not much of a newspaper. But when I wrote something there, the world just fell down around me. Everybody in the department decided this guy's got to go.
Oh, wow.
And it didn't matter what the rules were. We're going to flunk this guy out. We are going to marginalize him. We're going to remove ourselves from his committee so that he doesn't have any committee members. We're going to play with the math numbers on his exams to make sure that he gets the lowest possible score. They couldn't mathematically flunk me out of the classes, but my GPA went from a 3.7 to a 2.7 in one semester.
Wow. Wow.
Because I was given
incredible.
a D. Yeah, I was given a D in a 6-credit class.
Yeah.
As a grad student. It was brutal. And I would wander for 2.5 years in a just complete academic wasteland with no opportunities to escape.
Yeah.
My grades came up good enough that they couldn't kick me out. Right, I had over a 3.0 eventually. They gave me one semester instead of a year. Right, so all these rules were being bent and broken in order to try and kick me out of the program and make my life incredibly difficult. But why was that? It was because when I made claims about creationism, I incorporated science and said that science can actually lead us to a conclusion that is compatible with God as designer. In this case, I didn't even write a Young Earth article. I wrote something that was more blandly intelligent design, but it didn't matter, right? Had to go.
Yeah.
And that's where you see that tension show up, that all of a sudden somebody realized, oh, you're playing a game that looks like this. We've got to destroy you, right? And in a very finite game fashion, they tried, right? If I didn't get the right grades, if I didn't have a committee, if I didn't have, all these things, then I couldn't graduate. And they pulled every string imaginable and everything that probably wasn't imaginable. They did anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
Sounds awful.
oh, it was bad. The advisor to the program of paleontology sent me an email in the midst of all of this, said, and I quote, "I will not allow you to destroy what I have spent 30 years of my life building."
Oh my word. Wow.
Never
That's
forgot
heavy.
that email.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's heavy.
It was, right? So it's not surprising I ended up with a D in this class. First off, because emotionally this just was a truck
Right.
that hit me. And so I failed the next exam really badly, and I tried to claw my grades back up, but I also knew everybody in the program was trying to kick me out, right? So
Wow.
it was bad. Now
Yeah.
praise God, he didn't let that happen. He let me win that particular finite game
Yeah.
and walk away with a degree
Yeah.
eventually. But still, it's that difference of how one approaches science that was the real threat there. It was, the
Yeah.
Visigoths were inside the gate at this point, right? One of those creationists got in. He actually thinks science is helpful to his cause. We've got to stop that.
Right.
And they were thinking in a very finite game mindset. They weren't in a sense content or satisfied enough with evolutionary theory
They had to
that
be on the
someone like
offensive.
me,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. They weren't confident enough, which is really weird, right? This is my first year. I don't have a master's degree. I'm not destroying the world, right? It's not.
Right.
It's not one of these YouTube clips.
I find it really fascinating that the response is like that in a lot of venues. I mean, I get their responses all the time.
Mhm.
You know, being having a social media platform, and I think that generally, I think my channel is. I'm trying to be as balanced as I possibly can, and yet it doesn't matter. I mean, how many times people just are, flinging the dung my way is it's kind of interesting. But I mean, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. We're in a spiritual battle at the end of the day. So this is part of the Christian walk. It's part of the spiritual battle that we're in.
Yeah, and I applaud you, Ken, and your channel, and the tone that you bring to your channel, as one of the folks that is gracious and kind, and you lay out your case, but you also point out places where this is a challenge and this is
Mhm.
difficult, and you want to explore those areas and be gracious enough to say, yeah, this is a tough part, or hey, this used to look like a tough part, but we have an interesting answer for this now,
Right.
right? I liked your series dealing with feathered dinosaurs and the order of the fossil record,
Mhm.
right? We're given this. This is supposed to be the way that it all works, but when you look a little bit closer, actually, it's not looking quite like this. It's looking different.
Right.
But even in that, and what you've said so far today about not wanting these clickbaity titles for your videos and all that sort of stuff, right? This channel, and one of the reasons I love coming on and really appreciate the invitations, is that I know that when I come on here, you and I are going to be able to have a frank discussion about where creationism is strong and where it's weak, and
Right.
where we think it can go, because both of us think that young Earth creationism has a bright future ahead of itself.
Right.
If we think with this infinite game mentality, right?
Yeah.
If we think forward. Now, along the way, there will be these finite games, right?
Right.
This is the sun or the earth, the center was the Galilean example. But, does the fossil record show a good example of this or that as a transitional form? Or what do you do with this aspect of radioactive dating methods,
Right.
right? Those sorts of things can be finite game arguments where you're going to try to adjudicate a yay or a nay on those. Within young earth creationism, we spend a lot of time fighting over this type of stuff, right? A new fossil is found. Eventually, within a couple of weeks, somebody's saying it's not a transitional form, and the evolutionists don't know what they're doing, and all this sort of stuff, and it gets bad quickly.
Right.
But I think if we look at finite games as things that can be placed in service of the infinite games,
Hmm.
then we'll actually choose our finite games well.
Right.
And we will play those finite games well also, remembering that those finite games run on different kinds of rules,
Right.
right? Definite beginning, definite end, agreed upon rules, a debate, right, on YouTube or a debate in person. as a good example of a finite game in creationism. So, you've discussed, with colleagues and things like that. I've gone on YouTube or had some debates with folks like Hugh Ross, right? Old Earth creationist, my brother in Christ. He and I are both very conservative Christians when everything comes down to it.
Yeah.
We just kind of disagree about, this little chunk of scripture.
Right.
And our disagreement, or even then, is pretty narrow. Because both of us are inerrantists. We both believe in a historical, grammatical approach to reading the scripture. We've just got some difference of opinion on some key verses that lead us in different directions.
Right.
One of those debates is a finite game.
That's
And,
right.
at the end of the day, it's not Hugh or myself that decides who the winner is. It's the audience.
Right.
It's the audience weighing the stuff out.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we come back from that, and hopefully we go about the work of trying to advance our cause.
Right.
In the infinite game thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's excellent. Excellent. And, just going back to the scripture real quick here, we're running out of time. So, but, the scriptures, they give us a beginning and an end. They do give us a conclusion, right? So in a sense, from a theological perspective, and I would say a historical perspective, right? It's a finite game from a scriptural perspective, right? Because it has a conclusion. We know how things are going to turn out. And we know how things began. But applying science to that, especially as we're looking always, when it comes to the controversial issues, it's always stuff in the past, right? It's going to be an infinite game. We've got to play it as an infinite game, which means we've got to, as creationists, and I think, and you can maybe give some words on this as well, just as we're sort of bringing things to a conclusion here. How do we as creationists, here's an application, how do we as creationists then apply this infinite game to what we do, especially on things like social media?
Oh boy, that's a good question. So I'd say I would sum up my perspective on creationism as an infinite game as saying that our goal, as for you and I as creation scientists, but also as Christians, right, is that we are seeking to discover the works of God through His created world and guided by His inspired word. Right, to discover the works of God through His created word while guided by His inspired word. That is the infinite game that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And how we go about doing that, right? Obviously with science and experiments and field work for you and I as geology types and things like that. We've got those. In the realm of communication, which you do so well, I think keeping that in mind as the thrust of your channel, right? The thrust of your channel is oriented towards that. And then when the finite game issue shows up, right, and you've got one particular topic that you want to talk about, and we want to settle this thing in some way, just recognizing that's done in service of the infinite game that you and I want to play. It's not done in service to another person's game that I'm trying to destroy. Right? Because again, if I take my eyes off of the game I'm trying to play and I focus on somebody else, I'm not doing my work.
Right.
Now, with those finite games, you come to the middle from both sides and you try and play out your game. But if everything that I do is always focused on evolution, then I don't make progress with creation. And if the evolutionists never care what creationists are doing, they're just going to keep doing stuff. Like I said at the beginning, you're always going to be employed playing a finite game against evolutionists because they are involved in an infinite game. They want to discover the history of life on Earth or what happened with the tectonics of the plates over the past, 2 billion years or whatever that happens to be, right? They're going to be looking at genetics. They're going to be looking at population studies, whatever it happens to be. Most scientists are actually involved in an infinite game.
Yeah, right.
Most scientists don't even, they might care that somebody else's idea is wrong. Let's not even think about creation evolution. Let's just say you got two biologists, two different labs that are approaching a problem. They think they're right. There might be some papers critiquing and things like that. But if they don't focus on their own research and trying to show that their hypothesis is correct, then they're never going to make it. They're never going to get anywhere. And they're going to end up wasting everybody else's time trying to show somebody else is wrong. And if it turns out that they're actually right, then, the waste is double. The waste is just that much more. So, again, I really appreciated Simon Sinek's book and how he laid that out, and how businesses end up being deeply unhealthy when they focus intently on their rivals and view them instead as opponents that need to be defeated, like you're in a finite game.
Yeah.
And if on the other hand we can draw any lessons out of that for creationism, it's that God's world demands management and stewardship by us, because that was the job and the role that we were given at the beginning. Right? We were told to subdue the earth and to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the cattle and the creeping things. We are God's vice regents on this world. And that means that in order to manage it well, in order to steward it properly, in order to have the wisdom that we see in Scripture talked about all the time. What does it mean to be wise? It means to understand the world around you, how it works, and orient yourself into that flow.
Right.
Right. To go against that flow is where you hit being foolish. If gravity constantly brings things down, but you're holding out hope that this is going to float, you're going against the grain. And so biblical wisdom is knowing what our role is. And if our role is to be the vice regents of the world, is to bear God's image and be his representative here on earth, then that means the game of science, the infinite game of science, is about understanding and learning from his creation so that we might cause it to flourish.
Right.
So that when he comes, we have been good stewards.
Right.
Or at least, those of us who call upon his name, try our best to be good stewards and hope, to hear that and learn some things and bless the rest of the people around the world through what we've discovered.
Right. That's excellent. Great. I think we done the gamut again, Marcus. We come to a good conclusion there about how we need to approach creationism, and hopefully viewers can learn something from that, and we can too. So, Marcus, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Ken. It's always a joy and a pleasure. It's a delight to get to chat to you with you. So, thanks a bunch.
Right. Look forward to seeing whatever we talk about next, whatever that is. So.
Indeed.
Okay, so everyone out there, thanks again for joining us. Again, don't forget, pound the like button. I really appreciate that. Subscribe. And look, share this on your social media platform. If you thought this is sort of something interesting and people would benefit from it, to go ahead and share it on your social media platform. There is a link in the description if you'd like to give. Always appreciate that. As always, appreciate prayer. Pray for Creation Unfolding Ministries. Pray for Dr. Marcus Ross as well, and all the research that he's doing. And we'll see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.